right, great. Thanks, Pete. And special thanks to Karen for being here. Really appreciate you being here with us today. And thank you all for taking time out of your Saturday to be here with us. This is something that I get to talk about a lot, or I do talk about a lot, and not always to willing audiences. So thank you for being a willing audience to talk about this. And I'm just going to give the briefest overview of the history of zoning in Harrisonburg and kind of, give some local context and then turn it over to Karen. So if you just want to go to that first slide, I found out recently doing some research that Harrisonburg did not have a zoning ordinance until 1939. So 1939 is the first zoning ordinance that Harrisonburg had. There was no zoning prior to that. And so you get buildings that look like that in most American cities. There's no, you can't build this here because these rules. I'm just going to fly through this. So the Chamber of Commerce in Harrisonburg was really pushing for the adoption of a zoning ordinance. And so that's a clip from the Daily News Record in the 1930s. And this is what the zoning map looks like today. We started out with, I believe there were 4 zones in the original ordinance, and now you can see how many different zones we have today. You can go to the next slide. So, that's kind of, for better or worse, that's the heart of Harrisonburg, the Cloverleaf Shopping Center with one leaf removed. This if you all are familiar with Project R4, the area where Klein's ice cream is, this is what that neighborhood looked like before a redevelopment, with a grid network, lots of, primary streets, secondary alleyways, like a very, inherently walkable neighborhood. That was Newtown, which then got incorporated into Harrisonburg. And then in the 1950s with redevelopment, that's what it turned into. So you can see, and that is where the phrase, if you've ever heard the phrase, the city with the planned future, that came out of that era. So it was this idea that we're going to rip down, these neighborhoods and put in, redevelop it, take down blighted areas. That was, the black neighborhood in Harrisonburg, and you can see where Project R4 and R16, which goes all the way to Market Street, was knocked down. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that, but I did want to bring up that is, there was a point in time when the idea of taking down walkable neighborhoods and replacing it with parking lots was the planned future. So if you look at the next, so that's what, of course, that area looks like today. And, if anyone's ever walked through there, you know that it's mostly parking lots. And you see the giant parking lot around Roses. And then we can go to the next slide. And then in the and again, I'm flying through this because I want to turn it over to Karen. This is the Valley. So there was a housing crisis in the 1980s. And that was, we don't think about that very much, but these headlines are from the 70s and 80s, during a time when Harrisonburg was down zoning. So down zoning means, you go from allowing apartments, allowing townhomes, to allowing only single-family homes. And you can go to the next slide. And so I just wanted to pull out this quote from that story from Daily News Record, September 4th, 1989, or I think that was, 1989, when the city de-densified. That was a word used by a local, well-known local developer, Jerry Scripture, who said only single-family homes and duplexes would be allowed in R2 areas, and only parcels of more than So basically, making the restrictions much tighter, and the developers were warning that would raise the cost of housing, and lo and behold, it did. So we had this de-densification. And then, of course, in 1991, that was the demolition to make room for the courthouse and the jail in downtown. That was kind of during a period of time when, Harrisonburg, the downtown, was being abandoned. There wasn't a lot of, everyone was at the Valley Mall. And now, if you look at the Valley Mall, we're kind of, back where we started with that. So, and this is an animated GIF that I made using satellite imagery from 1984 to 2018. And you can kind of see this is the southeast side of town. So this is where a lot of student housing has gone. And you can see this spilling into the county. So this development, it's hard to see when we're on the ground, but it's much clearer to see when you're looking at something like this. You're seeing these developments go in, and you can see the scars in the earth and the scars healing up, and so we're seeing a lot more of that development. And of course, if it continued past 2018, we would see a lot more. It would go further out into the county. And just wanted to really make the connection. Obviously, these are environmental, climate focused groups who have put this event together. And this is something that we think about a lot. We talk about housing, we talk about climate, we talk about wanting to put make sure that we're centering people, and make sure that we're providing affordable housing. And yet, at the same time, if we're not willing to give up some of this restrictive exclusionary zoning, we have a climate problem. We cannot solve I think there's a thought that, you put solar panels on your house, put electric cars on the street, and then we're done. We don't have to worry about it. But that's, unfortunately, usually the simplest solutions also are false solutions. So this is kind of, to give an example of two Virginia towns. We've all been to downtown Stanton, and I'm sure we've all been through Manassas. And so these are very different. You've got your pre-zoning sort of downtowns, and then your, more recent, suburban sprawl, what we would call suburban sprawl, single-family homes. And so I won't linger on this. I can share this publicly later with everyone here and my sources for this. But I did want to touch on this. This was something from the American Farmland Trust that really shows, if you look on the left, those bar graphs on the left side, there's 3 different scenarios for the future of Rockingham County. So there's business as usual, which is the top one, that says 8,600 acres of farmland will be converted into mostly low-density housing. Then you've got runaway sprawl, which is that longest one in the middle there on the lower right. That's 10,700 acres of farmland in rural land that would be converted into low-density, mostly low-density suburban sprawl. And then better built cities, which is that last one, the lowest amount, that says, so that's kind of a best case scenario for Rockingham County. That's 4,900 acres that would be converted. So this was a study called Farms Under Threat 2040, done by the American Farmland Trust. So just wanted to kind of contextualize that as briefly as possible. So please apologize my speeding through that, but at this point I'd like to turn it over to Karen and continue with our presentation.
Thanks, Brent. And I too will be speeding through mine because I want to make sure we have room for conversation and questions. So are there any questions that you want to ask Brent before we move on, or you want to do everything at the end?
Yeah, just do that at the end.
Okay, so again, my name is Karen Campblin, and I'm just going to be talking about the equity piece on sustainable development. And then this really important quote is, sustainability without equity is sustaining inequity. So, but before we go into that conversation, I just want to give a brief background on what the Environmental and Climate Justice Program is with the NAACP. It's something that started about 14 years ago to combat the ill effects of the coal industry, and since then it has unfortunately become a more critical issue within the organization. And in 2020, the issue-focused program turned into one of NAACP's top 6 game changers. And what the game changers are issues that have been identified to have significant influence on the socioeconomic advancement of the Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. And so We have three main objectives: reducing harmful emissions, particularly greenhouse gases, advancing energy efficiency and clean energy, and ensuring a just transition to the new economy, and then, of course, strengthening community resilience and livability. So we're going to be touching on mainly 2 and 3, but mainly 3 for most of the talks. Throughout the years, we've published a lot of different reports dealing with whether it's energy, how to properly advocate for equity in emergency management planning, to pipelines, to you name it. And one of its newest programs that they developed in 2019-2020 was centering equity in the building sector. So I had pulled a part of it from there. And what had happened was, as they were looking at changing their headquarters in Baltimore, they realized that the building sector, the development sector, has a lot of inequity. There's not a lot of representation of women, of people of color, in addition to the disparities between affordability, access to resources, whether it's clean and affordable housing, whether it's education to be able to have a profession in these sectors, and whether it's just an opportunity for minority businesses. So they developed this program to try and identify what those disparities are, find those root causes, and then to identify those solutions, doing a community-based solution. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on, is how do we have more equity in our land planning and management initiatives around Virginia. And so some of the 3 things we try to make sure that as we identify these community-based solutions, that those solutions are regenerative, identifying the ill effects from the past and what are these solutions to help build and heal the community, but also making sure everybody wants to make sure that we're economically viable, right? So that we have to find that balance. We can't have one without the other, but we have to make sure those disparities no longer move forward and are influenced and are felt. And then, of course, cooperation. If you notice, I always say community-based, and that means community members, elected officials, staff, relevant agencies that aren't even involved, make them relevant, and it's that corporation. We can't, one of the saying is we're not single-issue people, right? There's always so many different issues going on, and that's how we should look at everything that we do moving forward, particularly our planning solutions. And then, of course, there's also the ecological, the environmental piece. We can't forget that. And then we also have to make sure we understand that how we interact with our built environment also impacts our quality of life, whether it's our mental state or physical state. So all of these things should be part of our solution base. We try to use an equity lens, and I'm quite sure you've heard of equity assessments and all of those things, and it can get complicated, it can get simple. But just for the context of this conversation, I'll try to keep it as simple and as high, we're in a jet high kind of level here, but, if you're ever looking at an issue, it has to be drilled down, and don't get me wrong, there'll be a lot more things that you would have to consider, but looking at the governance of what is happening, right? You're looking at an issue. Who's at the table? Who is part of that policy making? Are we talking to everyone? Do we have our elder communities there? Do we have our youth there? Do we have our BIPOC community there? Do we have our women? Do we have our men? We have to make sure that everybody's at the table when these decisions are being made. This picture, and I always stop to talk about it because this is a perfect example. We were in South Carolina, and we were looking at the sidewalk inventory in a historically African-American community, and we had this workshop, and we're like, yeah, we're going to go and do a walking inventory. Come on. We looked at our aerial maps, and we identified the path in which we're going to go, and we're going to talk about the built environment and all of these things, what amenities should be brought in. And there were a few students there, and they looked at our map, and they're like, no, that is horrible. You can't do that. So we said, okay, take us, you tell us where we need to go. And listening to those youth, those children that were with us, we were like, wow, if they didn't stop us and make us follow them, we would have missed this footpath. So what they have to do is cross over a railroad track to get to their school. And so they go up this, and the incline of this is just, the picture doesn't do it good any justice. And so this, so they highlighted this major disparity in their pedestrian and sidewalk inventory, which just looking on an aerial photo, we would have missed. And me not going to school, I would have missed it as well. So that's why it's so important to have so many different eyes at the table, or voices at the table, I should say. Eyes are like, no, voices at the table talking about all of these things. But we also have to look at how are resources being allocated, whether it's the budget. The budget tells what the priorities are, and that's an easy way to tell where your future path is going to go. So that's why it's so important to be involved in your local government's budgeting process, looking at what they're going to be publishing. Where is that money going to go? Is it going to those social services that we need to help us pull out of COVID? Is it going to those mental services? Is it going to sidewalks? That's a really good indication of the future of your community. But it also helps you to identify some of the, I cannot think of the word, some of the voids, let's just say, there's a better word for it, but it's not coming to me right now, within your community. Where are your food deserts? Why are we not seeing grocery stores or being able to have community gardens or those types of things? Why are they not there? In some suburbans, the answer is pretty clear. HOA covenants prevent people from using their gardens as live-in gardens. And that is, by design, an exclusionary zoning, which Brent had talked about a little bit. And we'll highlight that more as well, because it impacts the affordability of access to food, right? So it is purposely done so in HOA to try to limit, either by race or by class, who would be in those subdivisions. So looking at the root causes. And of course, underfunding school, that's a different story. We talk about property value and all of those things and how things are. So there are a lot of different things, but that is what we have to look at. There's so many different things that we can see just by seeing how is resources being allocated, where it's not being allocated, and look at the results of that. And, kind of what I was could segue into the outcomes. Who are being impacted by these by these policies? Who does it support? If there is a situation, who survives, and how quickly can that particular area within our community rebound? And so this is I'm quite sure you've seen this a lot in terms of reality. There's some classes or people who have more resources or access to more resources than others. So that's the reality. Equality is equal distribution of resources. That doesn't necessarily address the root cause. And then equity is distributing the resources as needed. But then somebody said, wait a second, if you think about it, equity implies that the individual in the purple shirt is unable to see and therefore needs support to see, right? And they said, so it's not necessarily the resource. There's a barrier that's preventing that individual from doing what they need to get done. It's preventing them from reaching their highest and their best potential. So instead of really don't get me wrong, looking at resource allocation is important, but that's what I was saying, also that root cause. There's a barrier that's preventing that community, that individual from reaching their highest potential. So getting rid of the fence, everybody can see. This is assuming it's a free game, right? But, and so, so this is what we're saying. If you're using all of these different lenses, the solution should be intentional and transformative and be a catalyst for change for positive. So going back to zoning, before there were land uses and all of these things, we had these tenement houses in New York. The conditions were poor. They were piling people up. So these were some of the things where we started seeing land use come up, where they had building codes, where you had to have ventilation between buildings, where you had to windows and all of those things. So theoretically, planning and zoning and all of those things can be used for the good. But it can also be used for the bad. There was a lot of different zoning out in Europe, and it started out in Germany. But when it came over to the United States, those zoning and those planning theories were then also used to separate classes by, uses. You've heard of the terminology redlining. You've heard of the terminology about something I just mentioned with the housing covenants that are used specifically. You've probably heard conversation about single-family zoning and large lot, large plot. The zoning and land use ordinances were also used to further cause for these race-based or class-based separation. And in that, in the long term, also impacted generational wealth. It impacted access to services. It impacted and kind of deterred or slowed down socioeconomic advancement for particular groups. So these are the things that, as we're looking at our planning and zoning changes, we want to make sure that we address those root causes and get rid of it, because even though those housing discrimination practices were identified as unconstitutional, the effects are still being felt across the country. So what did it also cause, right? Inadequate built environments. Just because of the land use separation, it influenced sprawl and leapfrog due to affordability and those types of things. It made municipalities harder for them to be able to provide adequate level of service for their service, public utilities or water distribution and sewer and stormwater, because the bigger the municipality gets, the more expensive it is to maintain. The more expensive it is to maintain, the less it's able to have a plan of good repair. And so that's why we're starting to see a lot of, or not really starting, but that's why a lot of our infrastructure is in decline. Bridges, highways, and those types of things. It was built to accommodate the sprawl, but we don't have the money to maintain. That's why having those development closer, having people to have more options in housing and transportation is just so important. It impacts the bottom line of the expenses. And like I said, it impacts mobility. Sprawl, again, also was very exclusionary because it relies, people were moving out because housing was cheaper than, but that would also mean that they needed cars to get to the better paying jobs. So I get stuck in this perpetual limiting, not really, I shouldn't say self-limiting, but a very limited cycle that just doesn't allow for that community and or individual for advancement. And like number 6, separating the urban poor from jobs, because once we had that urban flight and everybody went to the suburbs, so did the good paying jobs, right? And so again, transportation were limited coming from the urban center out into the suburbs. Again, limited access to by race or by class. And all of this is being done by design. And we can talk about the history of disparities in transportation for a long time as well. So it was a culmination, and you've heard land use, transportation, and the environment are intricately intertwined. We should never, I shouldn't say we should never, we should stop talking about them in silos because they are so influential on the other. And then housing disparities. I kind of went through some of this before we got to the slide, but land use and zoning regulations excluding certain types, right? Redlining and the single family zones at large lot lines. And so these exclusionary type of planning and zoning even impacts our quality of life. I already kind of touched on these again, but wastewater disposal, this is a great example of a community in which it was built in an area where it really shouldn't have been built. It was cheaper. People are moving in there. There's not enough stormwater management system to be able to handle the slightest of rain. But the impacts for that community is this water stands there for a week at a time, having mosquitoes. This was in Florida, so snakes, water moccasins, danger for the kids, danger for the health, and all of those things. So there's a lot of different ways in which these types of poor planning or discriminatory planning and exclusionary planning impacts our communities and our quality of life. And I already went through that. That's in there twice. And again, so looking at what are some of the solutions we can look at for with land use. These are a little out of context, so I'm trying to, in my mind, put it back into the right spot. But so some of the things that we can be looking at in terms of land use, in addition to that regenerative, ecological, social aspects, is making sure that we develop a mechanism in which land use works in tangent with housing to make sure that we have multiple housing options, right? Because we're hearing a lot about this, in which there's a conversation about we don't have enough middle housing, we don't have enough affordable housing. Well, there's the workforce development, and then there's those who are 30% lower than AMI, which are extreme poverty. So we need to try and make sure we have those, when we're discussing land use, that we're not making it harder for these types of housing options to be built in those areas. So those single family zoning, those large lot zoning policies prevent those types of housing developments from being duplexes, fourplexes, those types of things, or even multi-unit buildings. And then, of course, with transportation, with that compact development, focusing on that, having compact development, having more density around your transit hubs, supporting transit, and trying to make sure that there are more options than just having that single vehicle occupancy option, right? So that's sidewalks, that's bike lanes, that's those things.
Scooters.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Scooters. There's so many different options, and we also have to remember those who have mobility limitations. So sidewalks that, and if you look at the older cities, sidewalks used to be 5 feet wide, and now we've got, people on rollerblades, and so the gate, so they need a wider stance. So that's where you started seeing sidewalks getting to 7 feet wider and longer. And then we have to be able to make sure we can accommodate multiple people. So, looking at the sidewalk designs, making sure that there are no seams, so people who have issues raising their legs. So there's so many different things. That's why when we're coming up with these solutions, we have to look at how diverse our community is and to be able to accommodate them, right? And transportation is a very important part of that. And then, of course, we already talked about housing. As we're, and this is the sad part, as we are making plans to build a better community, it also impacts housing affordability. And so how do we protect the existing residents? So when there are improvements, we always know location, 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 the property value goes through the roof, right? Nobody wants transit, but the moment we add transit hubs, boom, property cost goes up, right? So we also have to make sure that the existing residents are also protected, and that can be done through tenant rights before the development starts. If there needs to be any type of temporary move, making sure that the existing residents have first right for the new plan that comes into place, having major consideration to the senior citizens. For instance, in Florida, when the housing values kept on going high, taxes went through the roof, they put a cap on taxing. So they said, if you bought your house by XY, I can't remember the year, your taxes won't increase. And so they created a Save Our Home program, and it was specifically for those that were people who were there before the housing boom. Everybody remembers that, right? And senior citizens, and it worked well. So they were able to accommodate new development without displacing most of their existing residents. And so there are things that can be done that way. And so there are different parts that we can look at that's going to impact what we're talking about. It's not, the solution isn't in one place. There's the local comprehensive plans. We've zoning codes, overlay districts that can help. There's design districts, all of these different things. And unfortunately, they kind of, influence each other. So if one change is made, you have to make sure you don't conflict or contradict, or maybe even identify changes in other areas of the municipality's guidelines that can help steer things in the future for long-range planning. And so some of the other common tools that are being used around the country to help transition to a new economy and to kind of get rid of all of those ill effects and negative influences of those exclusionary zoning practices from the past. These are some of the things that have been used in certain areas, and it can be used in various degrees. So it's not a one-size-fit-all for all communities, such as, given density bonuses. If you build here instead of another location, because one of the things which is really good, is to identify ahead of time where the density should happen in a community, and then kind of just have it, kind of grading out. We have got the density, and then as we exit out of the community, it gets less dense and less dense, but identify where those strategic activity centers are, where your transportation hubs are, and all of those things. And I think you have it a little, laid out in your comprehensive plan, and so those are some of the things that may need to be updated. I believe the comprehensive plan is up for update in 2023.
Yeah, so it'd actually probably be 2024, but yeah, they're looking at rewriting the zoning ordinance sooner than that.
Good time. Perfect timing. And so there are a lot of different ways you can do form-based code, which is more of a design focus. Like I mentioned, tenants' right, overlays, introducing medium density, high density, all of those things. And most importantly, looking at equity assessment. There are some communities that are requiring that if there's going to be a new development, that there needs to be an equity assessment done. Look at what's already there and how it's going to impact, what it's going to do to the demographics, what it's going to do to, how much is it going to impact if there is a, apartment complex, how is it going to impact? So understanding those things is going to be very helpful. So what I did was I played around last night, and I spent too much time on this. But it was just so much fun. So I went through and I looked at the comprehensive plan a little bit. I kind of zoned on it. And I don't know if you've ever seen those word arts where you take you take the text and then it highlights the most frequently used and comes up with this graphic. And so this is the word art for Harrisonburg's vision statement. And so I kind of highlighted some of the key words that are in the vision statement. Residents can walk safely down the street to work and play. Decent homes that everybody can afford. Working with the universities and making sure it's affordable for students. Great place to learn. Capitalizing on the amazing higher learning education institutions you have in the area. That everything that's done in Harrisonburg, you want to be proud of your assets, both your cultural and natural resource. It's an ideal city for the future, and I like this one. The air and the water in our streams will be cleaner in 2040 than they are today. And this was written, 2018? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, this is good. Efficient and effective service delivery. And so that's really looking at making sure that that leapfrog sprawl no longer happens, because the further out it goes, that means we got to get the service out there. So that's stretching the city budgets pretty thin. Transportation systems will work for all types of travelers. So there's a conversation about improving sidewalks and all of those types of things. And it's the economic hub of the region. So I love that. And then they came out with 18 goals. And so they had the vision statement, and when they updated in 2018, they had a bunch of community events and outreach and all of these things, and asked individuals what their visions were. So they took the vision statement and they took comments they received from the community to create these framing goals and use this to create their final goal, which I'll show you the word art for this.
And was anyone in this room, by show of hands, part of that comprehensive plan process in 2018? So, okay.
I love it.
Yeah.
So please correct me if I'm wrong, but
Yeah.
it was 4 in the morning when I read this, so I could be a little swirly in my head. But in the course of developing this comp plan, oh yeah, I just went through that. The work of the city staff, deliberation with the planning commissioners and the community, and they use the vision statement can help shape the implementation of the goals and objectives outlined. So it's like well-developed plan, use city education, enhanced comprehensive opportunities. And so they created. So from that, the next step was to create the goals. The city of Harrisonburg set the following goals for the next 20 years and beyond. These goals will inspire us to action, to devise the measures and policies necessary to make the city a great place to live, to raise a family, to learn, to work, and to prosper. And so out of all of the 18 goals, this is the word art. So it's like connected, opportunities, place, city, make, develop. So that concludes my presentation.
Thank you so much.